Welcome to another episode of the Black Bed Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Tony DeRamus, sporting my new Elmo coffee mug here. Welcome my special guest and also long-term friend, Arland Hill, Dr. Arland Hill. Good to have you on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here with you.
Yeah. You know, I've known you for a long time, and I've seen how important you've been to our company in general, you know, on the functional medicine side. But give us a little bit of your background. We've known each other for over 2 decades now. Right. You know, as chiropractor like I am, and you decided to take a different path into functional medicine. Tell me a little bit about that and your background.
Yeah. So originally from North Carolina, I grew up in an agricultural family over there, traditional agriculture. There was a lot of foundation that was laid there that I didn't realize until later, until actually sometime after we had already met, that led me into a lot of my professional decisions. Long story short on this, ended up in chiropractic school, became a chiropractor, but realized as I was going through chiropractic school, while I really enjoyed the musculoskeletal stuff, the nutrition spoke to me. The biochemistry just, it flipped switches for me that just, I realized that was going to be my drive and my passion. And looking back and realizing all those long days as a kid that I spent in my grandparents' gardens, that was probably the foundation for nutrition that gave me a mindset around how important food was. And as I got into practice, recognizing that what I knew as food growing up wasn't what food had become, and that trying to direct patients to even consume what we would consider real food was not as easy as what it should be. And from that, about 7 years ago, my wife and I made the decision that we were going to do something about that. And we started Harvest Hills Ranch, fully regenerative agriculture ranch that I blend with my clinical practice. Yeah,
I want to get into that in just a second too. But you know, as far as the education, because I know, you know, me going through chiropractic college, I know that I diverted and went into sports. So there's certain educations that I had to have for that as well. So now, in terms of what you do, what did you have to do that was different than, say, just that standard chiropractic education?
Yeah, so in addition, I have a 2-year postgraduate degree as a diplomate of the American Clinical Board of Nutrition. So federally accredited program there. Have to sit for the board exam, have to pass the rigorous test, have to write the case studies, all those things. But that was an additional 2.5 years of life on top of chiropractic education.
Yeah. And you mentioned food already too, but you know, functional medicine doesn't really necessarily mean the food, right? There's a lot of things that you do outside of that, and a lot of supplements as well. So explain what functional medicine really is, and how does that differ from, say, what we're seeing in traditional allopathic medicine, and how they're treating, say, diseases or maybe things that aren't what we consider too optimum in terms of their health?
Well, I think it's easier actually to start with the conventional model, because most people are familiar with that, which is to simply say that someone presents with a symptom and there's whether it's a pharmaceutical or surgery or whatever the intervention is, but it's directly aligned to the symptom and just alleviating the symptom. In contrast to that, functional medicine is looking at restoring function. So in terms of biochemistry, we're looking at finding where the breaks in biochemistry are at and being able to restore those, whether that means utilizing nutrients to fit that model, whether it means doing some type of hormonal support. But the bottom line on that is that you're looking to try to allow the body to function as it is designed and intended by replacing and giving what it needs. And sometimes, while I do have a food first focus, and obviously with what we do with the range producing food, you also have to recognize that for someone, especially with the degree of deficiency that has been created for a lot of individuals, to solely rely on food to get results in a reasonable time frame is not always a reasonable expectation, and supplements are still necessary. And so I still use supplementation to address that early dysfunction and then move towards more of a maintenance model based around food.
Makes sense. All right, so let's ask you this. So you know, we are as consumers in here in the United States, right? There is a ton of supplements that are out there, and when Dr. Oz was popular, I'd have patients who would come to me with this. Well, Dr. Oz said, take this. So then they have like 50 different bottles of things they were taking. What's your overall kind of opinion about supplements that we're taking, and how can we actually maybe cut back on the amount of money we're spending, because most of the supplements that are on the market right now are probably not very quality anyway.
There's so much in what you're asking there. The first thing that comes to mind for me on this is that less is more. We mistakenly have an idea that supplements are either beneficial or inert, and that they either are working and creating good in my body or they have no negative effect. And the reality is that that's not the case. And we can see this by what are known as nutrient-nutrient interactions, meaning that if we oversupplement one nutrient, we can actually induce a deficiency in another. There are numerous examples on this. One that just simply comes to mind for me, B12 and zinc. Those two can interfere with each other if not balanced equally. Vitamin A and zinc, calcium and magnesium, vitamin E and selenium. I mean, there's numerous of these nutrient-nutrient interactions that really should be accounted for, and just blanketly taking supplements just in the idea that they're all going to be beneficial. It's just not an accurate representation. So again, I go back to the idea that less is more. The question is, how do you get to that? And how do you actually make the right selections with that mentality? And this is where you have to start to look at prioritizations, realizing that when it comes to function, typically one area of dysfunction is driving another area of dysfunction. So if you can keep digging down and asking, why is this happening, and get to the most rudimentary, most elemental component of why that bigger picture of symptoms is presenting, you can really move into as few as supplements as possible to correct the issue. You don't need a grocery bag full of supplements.
Okay. Yeah.
Which probably brings up the other question of quality, right?
Yeah.
And this is huge, because in sum on this, it really comes down to a professional doing their due diligence and trying to find a professional that is doing that. You and I have had numerous conversations around what this actually looks like. I'll give you an example here. One of the things that I see often talked about and touted so aggressively when products are marketing is third-party testing. Third-party testing is really a baseline. It shouldn't be the epitome of where we're looking to try to go with quality assurance. A better strategy on this is, and let me back up. When you say third-party testing, that's only looking at the end product. You're sending that product out, but it doesn't give you any input about the raw materials that are going into that product, where testing should also take place at. You also want to look at the testing through the production process as well as at the end of the production process. So at a minimum, supplementation should be checked 2 to 3 times, which around Black Belt Health, we know that that's taking place. And that's not the norm, even when it comes to doing third-party testing. So we have to really question, when we see these terms get thrown around and held out as the gold standard, are they really?
Yeah.
Not really.
So you're saying this, so some of these nutrients in the manufacturing process could be destroyed maybe through heat mechanisms or maybe something of that nature that could...
That's possible, but I'll give you an even more simplistic idea of what could happen. Let's say a protein powder with like a replacement protein powder with nutrients added into it is being produced. Well, how do you know that you're actually getting the right combination of nutrients in there in the right ratios to meet that label claim unless you're doing in-process testing on that? You don't know that. The other thing is, when it comes to testing, and this is especially true when we start looking at botanicals, how do you know that the botanical actually contains the adequate levels of the actives, whether that's, say, a polyphenol or a terpene or alkaloid or whatever these subcategories are? How do you know that it has an adequate composition of those if you don't do some pre-testing on that ahead of actually putting that product into production? You're, by the time, and understand the economics behind this, by the time you've put a product into production and it didn't meet that criteria and you got it all the way to the final endpoint, the likelihood that a producer is going to take that and just eat that if it doesn't meet what the third-party testing tells them is unrealistic.
Very, exactly.
That's just, nobody's doing that.
Yeah, right. It's economics of the decision making.
It's economics,
there, yeah. So, all right. So when I go back to food here too, so you convinced a lot of people here that maybe food is obviously the right choice, even in the micronutrient type of perspective. But would you, when we look at macronutrients, so proteins, fats, carbohydrates, where do you see, because if we're paying attention to just the macronutrients, then the micronutrients will typically come with that bag, right? Yeah. So in terms of the type of and the ratio of macronutrients, and we're gonna delve into the actual farm here in a second. What is your opinion about this? Because if there's a lot of controversy whether you should be a carnivore type of diet, whether you should be a vegan or vegetarian type of a diet. There's people out there that get so fanatical about one particular type of either category or even one type of food. There was a gentleman a long time ago that, and this actually came from an ex-UFC fighter. So this is a guy who was fighting on a regular basis, and his diet was, he was following a banana diet. There's some guy, some fruitopian, which that sounds like a name for somebody that's kind of loco in their head, but a fruitopian that would only eat bananas. So what's your opinion about how we ratio out these macronutrients and should we have carbohydrates or should we just be on a complete keto diet?
Well, it comes down to what is it that our body needs. And I think as the most basic starting point on this, we should prioritize proteins. Just if you look at the majority of the body, it's protein. And so when we think about it in terms of replacing structure or building good competent structure, bone, muscle, organ tissue, and then even looking also into different metabolites in our body. For example, some of what we would call our peptide hormones, like our thyroid or insulin, growth hormone, looking at different neurochemicals like dopamine and tryptophan or serotonin leading into serotonin. These are all of protein origin. And so if we don't meet our demand with the adequate supply of protein, we can only from that starting point expect to revert. We can only expect to go backwards. So proteins are an absolute starting point on this. As for more than one reason, because of observation with patients, but also because of reading in the literature and just seeing how much really researchers out there pushing the envelope on the amount of protein that they're giving individuals and seeing positive outcomes without what have often been attributed like kidney function. It's often been stated that if you increase your protein beyond a certain point, you're going to damage your kidneys. Well, that's just not true. That's just not an accurate statement. And so I think you start there. Secondarily to that, you have to start asking from here, what is my activity level? And this is where fats and carbohydrates come into the conversation. Even though I'm starting our conversation out with protein, and I am very much a animal-based individual, I'm not a no carbohydrate individual. Yeah. And the reason that I think this is important is that you also have to look at what are the needs of the body. Well, let's just take the brain, for example. The brain requires anywhere from, depending on the source you read, to 25 to 33% of our glucose utilization.
Very energy demanding.
Very energy demanding. The gastrointestinal tract is about 40%. So when you take a source like glucose away, you're automatically handicapping your mental function. And some might argue on this that, well, what about ketones? I can do that on an ongoing basis with ketones. Maybe that is true for some individuals. And if it works for you, then by all means continue that. But for the reality, for most individuals, they find that at some point, and this has been my observation clinically, that you're going to start seeing a suppression in your hormones. Initially, it's going to be with cortisol because you're living in a chronic hypoglycemic state. And so your body's chronically trying to balance out and keep that glucose level optimized. But you can only do that for so long before you start affecting other hormones. Estrogen, progesterone, DHEA, and testosterone are all going to take a hit at some point. Yeah. We could have a whole show just on protein synthesis alone, because what you're referring to is some of the latest studies now are showing that this ingestion of protein, which there was a point in time where we had to eat protein multiple times throughout the day. And there's a gentleman, I can't remember his name, and he's saying that really our first and last meal should be the ones that we really focus on our protein, because we're in this catabolic state when we wake up. And of course, before you go on this long fast before you sleep at night, take your protein in. But now there's a research that showed that the ingestion of a slow moving protein, like a whey protein, not whey protein, so I use casein protein in the study, that protein synthesis took place for upwards of 12 hours and it continued on. So, but I'm like you. I mean, so just even the neurotransmitters you mentioned, because I wrote the book Secret Addiction, and I made a joke in the book at one point that when you see a lot of these hippies, these pot smokers, right? And I'm not picking on pot because I used to be one too. So, but when you see them, a lot of them are this hippie lifestyle, they may be vegetarian or vegan in that matter.
But then I started looking at it, so, okay, well, if our neurotransmitters are built upon, say with serotonins and dopamines and all the other ones, the whole host of them there, are built on these complete proteins, then is that one of the reasons maybe they're not getting sufficient levels of the neurotransmitters because of a lack of protein and causing this deficiency in mood, if you will. And it was funny because when I first wrote the book, I joked about that. But now in hindsight, I'm looking at it and go, well, maybe it was right.
Yeah.
He was right.
I definitely think you were on to something there. And I've seen this with my own patients that when individuals are complaining about neuropsychiatric disorders, one of the easiest first steps is just make sure you're meeting your baselines on your protein. And when you think you've met your baseline, push a little bit higher.
Yeah.
Because that's probably more of an optimal level for what you need.
Yeah. So, okay. So let me ask you that then. What do you think, and I'll go back to the carbohydrates because that's a good topic, but what do you think are the protein requirements? And I know what they are, and I know what you recommend for patients, but explain that a little bit in detail, because it's a little bit different than what we've been taught, right? It's a little bit higher than what we've been taught. So what do you recommend in terms of that?
Well, let's talk about what we were taught, because that's an interesting baseline to start from, and it shows how much of a difference here, because we've often been taught, and this is what we were taught, that a baseline is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so for you guys that are not on the metric system, right. My apologies.
My next question.
Yeah. But I'm going to switch this over here to more imperial. I actually now recommend all the way up to 2.2 grams per kilogram, which equates to 1 gram per pound of body weight, which is much easier, right?
Yeah,
so 180 pound male, 180 grams of protein per day is what we should be shooting for. And we shoot for that number because what we understand is that earlier number I gave, the 0.8, that is only meant to be just to keep you at neutral, but that's to keep you at neutral if you're sedentary, if you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
Even for when you start to look at the athletic population, the literature started to trend more to like 1.5, 1.6, and now it's even, like I said, 2.2 and above. So the question probably here is, if you're at, and again, I'll use the 180 gram or 180 pound male, if they're consuming 180 grams per day, is there a downside to consuming more than that? No, there's not. Yeah. There's only really benefit to be derived from that.
Yeah, man, we're pissing off a lot of Netflix shows right now because there's a lot of this, right? There's Game Changer that's out there, and they make a good argument because going back to MMA fighters, they show there's a lot of MMA fighters that are utilizing that approach, and that's heavy training. I mean, and it really a combination of all types of training. So in MMA is one of those unique sports where you've got both anaerobic and also aerobic capacities you're dealing with. You're dealing with a lot of heavy lifting in some cases, so a lot of muscle breakdown, glycogen expense, energy systems, that sort of thing. But yeah, so I think it's going to irritate a lot of people. But if you're sophisticated enough to where you can make yourself a complete protein, possibly so. But even plant proteins, when you look at that, it's not as bioavailable protein as you would think, say in a beef protein or maybe even a whey protein.
Even when you look at something like a pea protein, which is definitely better than what you're going to consume by trying to acquire all that protein from a plant-based diet just by eating the real food, you're still only looking at about 80% bioavailability on that. So it's still pretty low. It's nowhere near comparable to a whey protein. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So anyways, if you're upset about that, get in touch with Dr. Arland Hill. He can explain it to you. So energy food, important topic, right? I'm, 8 o'clock at night. I'm going to go to the refrigerator because I want to eat something healthy, and I decide to go and grab a cup full of blueberries, right? Probably not a good thing. And so we should look at our food in terms of carbohydrates as energy food. So what is your feeling about the timing aspect of some of these energy foods? Because I've actually heard some people, so they don't hit this hypoglycemic state at night, and they wake up. So I've heard suggestions, well, maybe take some, take protein before you go to bed. But then some people say, well, when you go into that state, just wake up and sip on some orange juice. I'm probably getting circling this question here, but let's start with the timing aspect first, because they should be considered energy foods. And then what do you think about that hypoglycemic state that a lot of people suffer with by waking up in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock, and they can't go back to bed?
Well, to answer this question, I feel like you have to start off by acknowledging that the consumption of the carbohydrate food sources is rarely ever happening in isolation, meaning that it's typically consumed with a protein and a fat, or at least a protein there, right? Yeah. So you have to factor in the fiber. Those all have to factor into what the assimilation rate is on that carbohydrate source, right? Optimally, to take advantage of the window around our activity, when we deplete the glycogen stores in our muscle, it makes sense that you would consume carbohydrates around that depletion phase, because now your body's looking to preferentially refuel the muscle tissue, if you will. You want to shunt that glucose back into the muscle, restore the glycogen levels. So I would say timing around activity makes the most sense. And then just stepping back and asking, outside of going and doing formal exercise, what is your general activity level? Yep. My activity level is much different on a day that I have to sit down and I have to do computer work at my desk versus a day I'm out on the farm doing a lot of ranch related activities, right? It's vastly different. And my carbohydrate consumption is going to vary based on that. But one of the things that I try to do is get patients away from the fear of carbohydrates, because you leave a lot of valuable dietary components on the table, especially when you're looking at carbohydrates that are coming from fruit sources. And when I say fruit sources, I want to be more expansive on that, because, for example, if you take a butternut squash or like any other type of large, what we would call winter squash, those are considered the fruit of the plant. Most people consider those vegetables, but it's not the plant you're eating. You're eating the fruit of the plant, and the carbohydrate quality of that food is actually pretty high. So it really matters what the starting point is, what you're combining it with, and then timing it around your activity. And you don't have to be excessively meticulous about this, but just have a general idea. If I'm going to be active, let me pick up my carbohydrate intake. If I'm going to be less active, let me pull it down a little bit.
Yeah. So would there be a certain time of day that you would start maybe veering away from the carbohydrate intake? I guess that's just commensurate with what you're expending at the time.
Yeah. So, and this may be my bias just based on my activity. I work out in the morning, so I tend to consume a higher carbohydrate load in the morning, and that tends to taper off as I go throughout the day. But that being said, I don't completely eliminate my carbohydrates. I may consume some carbohydrate with my evening meal. Okay. And my preference for doing that is that increases the movement of tryptophan and serotonin across the blood-brain barrier. So it's allowing me to be more rested at night. Okay,
so it helps you sleep better then. Okay.
It's helping me sleep better. But again, I'm also combining it so that I'm not just dumping a load of glucose into my system too, which, to your earlier point about about hypoglycemia hitting through the night, these are some of the same tactics we can use in that scenario as well. We can make sure that there's a dietary combination that's going to slowly deliver that carbohydrate over time, but yet we're also... Many of these individuals find that their ability to balance the blood sugar, they've reached a point where it's not only just a macronutrient balancing conversation, it's also a hormonal conversation. So we have to go back in and do some work with the hormones typically as well to get those individuals to stay asleep at night.
So what are your favorite carbohydrates? People are going to want to know this for sure.
Let me break these into categories. I would say the one that probably is going to mess some people up that I do eat is white rice. I eat white rice because it's one, I can get a good, clean, organic source of it. But the other reason is because it's just an easy carbohydrate. There's no antigenic component to it, allergenic component to it. The likelihood that I'm going to react to it is extremely low, and I'm not eating it every day. Again, I'm timing it around workouts, but that's one of my sources that if I need more carbohydrate in my diet, I lean on that one. I do fruits. I don't keep track of my fructose. I don't eat fruit at every meal, but if I want a banana or I want some blueberries or whatever fruit I want to eat, I eat it.
Yeah. And it's kind of really bad rap lately too. And I hate to hear that, because I'm a fruit eater myself. But some of these influencers are saying don't put bananas in your shake anymore. But then you talk to, which we're going to get into gut microbiome here in just a little while. But they say it's a great prebiotic to put inside your shake, right? So I mean, fruit's got a terrible rap.
And this is, some of the listeners of this will have heard about the FODMAPs diet. This is one of my critiques of the FODMAPs diet is that you're taking out fruit, but you're doing it at the expense of all the other beneficial compounds that come with fruit that improve the microbiota. And again, a topic we'll get to, but I include fruit in my diet. I think it's a valuable carbohydrate source. I even include honey in there. One of my favorite post-workouts is to get a couple of spoonfuls of honey and just ingest that real quickly as soon as I get done. That's my immediate go-to. And then I do, like I mentioned, the large winter squash. I'll do that. And I do potatoes, so sweet potatoes. But I don't just limit myself to just the orange classic sweet potato. I do white sweet potatoes. I do purple sweet potatoes, different varieties of the orange.
Why is it?
One is just the taste. There's just variety there, and I enjoy those. If you've never had a Japanese yam, which is the white sweet potato, it's phenomenal.
It's probably kind of tricky. Like that looks like a regular potato. And it's going to have a sweet taste to it.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. And even just your regular red and white potatoes, like what we classically think about, I'll eat those as well.
Okay. That's awesome, man. There's so many misconceptions about the type of foods that we eat. I think people are missing out on a lot of nutrients. I mean, and back to fruit again. I mean, there's so many phytonutrients that you can be consuming with that. There's a lot of good fiber you could be consuming with that as well, and having a damn good time doing it too.
For sure. I mean, you bring up a point there, which is that there's a mental satisfaction when you eat that. You're satisfying. It's satiating, right? There's a satiating element to that. And when you deprive yourself of that on an ongoing basis and not eating with just wild abandon, right? I mean, eating with common sense and still eating real food. But when you consume those carbohydrates in your diet, you're providing that little stimulus to the nervous system that says, yeah, I'm satisfied. I got that little sweet fix and I'm good.
Yeah. So now we've left out a macronutrient here. And I'm sure the macronutrient is pretty upset with this, but fat. Right. Fat. And that was, so I've been in this game for a long time. And even when I was probably 18, 19 years old, I was a personal trainer. Right. And that was the time when we were going through the fat free, I mean, I had this one, I felt so bad. I had this one girl, she's a researcher at U of H at the time. She's a very smart girl. And I'd give her a book to read. She'd read it through the weekend. And I bought into that fat free thing. And so she's over there eating all the fat free potato chip, what they call snack balls, I think. I think there's snack balls. And she would never lose any weight. Not a bit. So, and then you fast forward now where, fat's a very important part of my diet. Now, it's debatable on trans fats, which I know you've got your opinion on trans fats as well, but you've got some really good fat out there that are brain healthy, that satiating, as you mentioned. So your avocados, your olive oils, you got all these great fats. Dive into that just briefly and give your opinion about even trans fats for that matter.
Well, I think it depends on the trans fat we're talking about. So not all trans fat can be lumped into the same category. If it's a man-made, manufactured trans fat, that's generally going to be recognized as a problem. But you take a trans fat as you would find in beef, transvasinic acid. This is it's produced in the rumen of cattle, and it shows health benefits. It's not detrimental, right? So kind of as with most things, you can't lump everything into the same category, right? But I think from there, then you start to look at the three main categories of fat: your polyunsaturated, your monounsaturated, and your saturated fat. And I tend to lean much heavier on the latter two, and even within those two, lean more heavily on the saturated fats. And many people are going to be on the fence about this because they're going to look at that and go, well, that's going to drive your cholesterol levels up.
We've had conversations about cholesterol levels too.
I mean, there's any number of things that we could say here, and not to be redundant about what's been said on other podcasts 1,000 times at this point, right? But when you look at that cholesterol, just ask yourself, if the elevation in cholesterol within reason has a health promoting benefit. And the short answer is that yes, it does. It's a driver of hormones. It optimizes cell membrane integrity. It helps shuttle triglycerides around in the body where they need to be at. So there's a lot of advantages to that cholesterol within reason increasing. So I don't look at saturated fats as an enemy. I look at them as an ally because they also create a more stable membrane, cell membrane, which is less prone to oxidation and damage Whereas when you start unsaturating with the monos and especially with the polys, those fats and those membranes become more susceptible to damage, which means that if we're talking the mitochondrial membrane, the mitochondria become less functional because they're beat up by oxidation. And that translates into a lack of energy, which you've got a world of people running around with fatigue.
Is that one of the reasons why you don't want to cook with olive oil and heat it up? Or why maybe olive oil is cold pressed?
Well, in that case, you would be looking at more of a rancidity, so you would be damaging the oil. When we start talking, many have heard about seed oils, and seed oils is where you get into those multiple points of unsaturation that don't create stability in the cell membrane, and they're even more prone to damage when you start heating those up. If you're going to heat an oil, you're really better off with a saturated fat.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool, man. That was a nice little diversion of what we were going to talk about. That's how it always goes like that with you, though. But I want to talk about the ranch a little bit. So 7 years ago, you started this ranch. You probably got into it with these ambitions and visions, and then got really into it and go, what the hell was I thinking? Right? Because I mean, regenerative farming is a different animal, right? It's just completely different what other people do typically in farming. You know, so let's ask Coach, so why did you get into that? You kind of answered earlier about, you felt a purpose in terms of the food supply. And then why regen medicine? I mean, is there another way to make things organic to where they're still healthy for the body without having to go regenerative farming?
Again, you bring up so many topics here that just at a minimum need to be touched on. Yeah. So for me, having come from that conventional background of farming, but over the time through chiropractic school and just my time in clinical practice, being more organically minded, more health, with healthy food of mind, realizing that when we started Harvest Hills Ranch, we realized that there was going to be a collision there because you couldn't take the old practices or the practices that I grew up with of damaging the soil and constantly do that and then also have a nutrient dense food. Those two were just misaligned with each other. What ultimately pushed us in this direction was two things. One personal, one observational. Observational was giving a recommendation to my patients to go and find a particular food that was advantageous to where I was trying to steer their health and them not being able to find it of the quality that I had suggested to them. And then two, being hoodwinked at the farmer's market myself and realizing over time that asking enough questions that I was getting snowed with what I was being told at the farmer's market. And I don't want everyone listening to this to think that I'm being anti-farmer's market. I'm not, but I am going to tell you because early on in the life of Harvest Hills Ranch, we were considering being a part of a farmer's market local to us. And we even looked at a couple that weren't local to us. And what we realized is that we didn't want to be part of the groups, part of those markets themselves, because we could see the tricks that were being played. And I got into this, and I state this emphatically on our ranch website, that transparency is what I am about. That's what I did not have access to as a clinician making a recommendation to a patient or for myself and my family. And I was done with that. I was going to have a way for people to see that if you want to see how quality food, nutrient-dense food is raised, we're going to do that. We're going to show you that this can be done, and it can be done without compromise. It can be done without chemicals, with the intelligence of nature coming to light.
So what kind of tricks were you finding?
Well, what a lot of what was happening was that individuals at the farmer's market would go to the supply warehouses, the same places that many of the grocery stores use, and they would buy at these supply warehouses every week. And that's what they were bringing to the farmer's market, in turn making the claims that they were producing this on their own farm, and they weren't. They had no knowledge about where these foods were coming from. For example, you would see things show up in Chiquita boxes, right? Chiquita bananas. Well, Chiquita banana boxes are everywhere at these markets, right? And so they're just throwing things in there, and then they're stuffing them under the table, hoping nobody sees them, or throwing them in the back of their vehicle. And we're just kind of sitting back at a distance watching all this and going, these people are being hoodwinked. And it would be, Doc, it would be so agitating, because you would see this mom show up with 2 or 3 kids, and the kids would be bouncing around, happy that they're going to the farmer's market, making a good decision. And you're sitting here going, they're about to be lied to.
And they were just the middleman
They were the middleman is all they were.
Wow, that's crazy.
And I saw that was on the produce side more. And I saw it on the meat side, where I would I would go to purchase, and the conversation I was having, thinking it was with the producer, was also with the middleman. Yeah. Now, listen, I'm going to be fair to you. I've been in the agriculture game long enough to know that there are some farmers that are not good people, right? And so they need somebody selling for them. But I should also be able to ask that person at the farmer's market the question and get an honest answer. And when someone couldn't give me that honest answer, looking me in the eyes, I knew something was wrong.
And I've seen that happen before too. I mean, even, we love Costa Rica, even going to Costa Rica, there's a lot of stuff you buy. But, I think the common question is this organic? And more than likely, the common answer is going to be yes. And the common reality is probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah. That's tough.
Well, if you don't mind, I do want to grab that term for a minute, because this is the other thing, is that many individuals look at the term organic and they think that's the gold standard. And it's not. Just one is an example that you just gave, but also because organic doesn't give you any information about nutrient density. It speaks nothing to the micronutrient composition of that food. It only tells you that it's chemical free. And that's with a little asterisk, because, for example, I'll use this example. In the state of Washington, organic apple growers are allowed to use antibiotics in their treatment. How does that even make sense? It's a chemical. And so my fear is, we've already reached the point with the term organic when it's been where it has been diluted down. One of my biggest fears, and I shouldn't even say it that way, one of the things I foresee coming down the road is that same type of thing is going to happen to the term regenerative. Sure. And so this is why we are a regenerative farm. But I'm even hesitant into how much I use that terminology. And it's really, at the end of the day, regardless of these terms, it's about nutrient density. That's what food is about in the first place. If you're not getting nutrients from food, why are you eating it?
What's the point?
What's the point?
Wow, that's crazy. Now, I've been out at the farm, the ranch, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Well, first, let me ask you, so what kind of learning curve did you have to go through in order to figure this out? Pretty difficult.
Drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, right.
Drinking from a fire hose. Having minimally been around livestock to the degree that we are now growing up, because I came from more of a row crop environment, and now fully dealing with livestock. There's a huge learning curve. I mean, I can remember my wife and I standing in the pasture, having to move cows from one pasture to another, thinking, I'm about to get killed by these cows. How am I going to do this? And now we walk up to the animals and we just put our hands on them, and it's no big deal, right? But it was a huge learning curve to one, develop relationships with the animals, over time develop and I'll just speak to our cattle for a moment, to develop a herd that is a very docile herd, but also has the genetic profile that we're looking for in our herd. And then to secondarily start to integrate other species of animals in that can work commensally with the cattle and with the other animals that we raise.
Yeah. I know this can't just be a hobby, because I know how much work you put into the farm, the ranch. What are the economics of that decision? I mean, that learning curve had to cost you a little bit of money, I would imagine.
Oh, it wasn't cheap.
Yeah, right? So I probably lost a lot of money in the very beginning trying to figure this out.
Well, for sure. And I think one of the things that we have to look at with farming is that in the business of agriculture, the profit margins are thin. They're not huge profit margins.
Not a lot of room for mistake then.
No, there's really not a lot of room for mistake. So did I have to pay for some of that in the outset? 100% I did. But it also makes you more shrewd and more efficient at how you do things, and you start to make a lot better decisions a lot quicker.
Yeah, I bet you do. Yeah. So what are some of the things that we can find out there? I mean, it's I know. Full disclosure, we buy the majority of our food from you. There's some things we just can't get that we'll still purchase. But what are some of the things you're growing and in terms of the cattle? That's there obviously. So in terms of meat and also vegetables.
Yeah, so on the cattle, let me start there. We have a beef cattle herd. I have a kind of a composite of different breeds, but it's basically built around what's called South Pole breed. And the reason I like them and have moved in that direction is because you would tend to think, especially with terms like grass-fed and grass-finished being popular terms now, the mindset would be that any cow will work in a grass-fed finished system. And that's not the case. And that's definitely not the case in Texas, where it's in general a hot, humid environment. So we've selected a species that can handle the environment. It can handle the parasite load. It can handle the 100+ degree days that we have endlessly in the summer sometimes. Yeah. And they thrive on grass. So there is no necessity for giving grains or anything like that. It's just not necessary.
And they're still gonna be fat enough to...
There'll be plenty fat. Okay. Yeah, plenty fat. So we have the beef cattle. We have a dairy cow. I would love to do more with dairy, but state regulations are just a huge pain when it comes to that. But nonetheless, we have a dairy cow. She's probably my favorite animal, only because I interact with her twice every day, much closer than what I do with all the other ones, right? I mean, we're having conversations there at the milking station. Sometimes I don't think she wants to listen. But then we have multiple species of birds. So we have the laying chickens, laying ducks, and then we raise meat chickens and meat turkeys as well.
Okay. Yeah, that was one of the things I was really surprised. And actually, I'm not trying to sell the ranch and all that. What I'm trying to do is I want to get to the point where, why do they call it regenerative? Like how do all these things tie together in something like that? And I think that's a really cool part. But one of the things I didn't realize that, chickens, these are not very old by the time you take them to, by the time from your ranch to my table. How old are those chickens?
7 weeks.
7 weeks, and they grow that fast.
They grow that fast. And a lot of folks will look at that and go, well, you got to be giving them steroids. We're not. We're not giving them anything that you would disapprove of.
Yeah.
They're on pasture pretty much all the time. We start them out in a brooder just so we can control their environment, because they don't have their mother at that point. But we control that in the early weeks, and then we move them out to pasture, and that's where they live their life. We give them non-GMO feed. I use a single source farm from within Georgia that I can pick up the phone. I can call both the farmer and the mill and have a personal conversation with them. And that is the only source that we pull feed from, period.
Okay.
And it's 7 weeks because of genetics. And I mentioned the importance of the genetics with the cattle. The genetics play a role when it comes to all species. So for example, this is even true when you look at laying birds. Some laying birds, chicken, duck, have a higher lay rate. The same is true for the meat chickens. You would never take the genetics of a laying chicken and use them for meat. They just don't have much meat on them. But the selection of genetics for the meat birds, they're selected to have a higher meat. And the truth of the matter is that these birds don't generally do well, especially in a hot environment like Texas, when you start carrying them beyond that, because they're fast gainers and they just don't handle the heat. They get hot easily. They get overheated. It becomes not a good scenario for the bird.
All right. Well, before we move into the plant stuff, I want to talk about, when you have to take these cattle and to process these cattle, that's a big controversy. How is it done? And do you think it even matters? Because you've seen probably all different styles of having it happen. And I think that's, when you watch some of these Netflix shows, for example, that's pretty much where they're going to get you, right? A bunch of chickens in one coop, and how you process these animals. Do you do humanely? So talk about that a little bit. And are there certain chemicals, like we've heard, that get produced in these animals, and then do those chemicals stay inside the meat when we eat the meat? So I know it's opened up a big topic for you, but go ahead and take that over. I'm curious to see what you have to say about that.
Let me do this. Let me take the chickens, and then I'll take the cattle. And I want to start off this portion of the conversation by saying that those animals are my livelihood. I can't afford to abuse those animals, right? And the other thing is that when you're out there every day, just like I mentioned with the milk cow, right? Having conversations with the milk cow, right? Some of you would probably be surprised at the things that we go out of our way to do for animals sometimes. As far as the chickens go, our chickens are raised in small mobile coops. We max out at 30 birds per coop. Most of the time, I don't even run them that kind of density. I'm usually around 25, so they're spread out quite a bit. And they're being moved constantly every day. So literally every day they get a fresh paddock of grass, and all the manure that they lay down is left behind. So it's one, a more sanitary environment for them. It gives them fresh grass, fresh bugs to eat on, and we get the benefit of the manure fertilizing the pasture.
Part of the regenerative portion.
Part of the regenerative portion on this, right? Because as that manure hits the ground, as those plants stimulate growth, now that's giving feedback into the ground. The microbiota are being more proliferative. Then the microbiota start pulling more nutrients into the plant, give it more availability to flourish. So it's just a fulfilling cycle on itself, right? So when the chickens, we load them up, we put them in individual crates. So there's about, when I say individual crates, let me be more specific. There's about 7 to 8 birds per crate. It varies depending on what their size is for that batch. They go to the processor, and they do use what's known as a kill cone. It's just a cone with a hole in the bottom of it. What they do with the bird is they turn the bird upside down and put them in the kill cone. When you turn that bird upside down, the bird essentially goes to sleep. Okay. It just literally goes into a state of unconsciousness. So it is the most quick and efficient way that you can humanely do it. They're not going through and just putting them on a chopping block and chopping their heads off or anything like that, right? And I also think it's important to note in this conversation that the processing facilities that we use are small processing facilities. So I'm not using the same processing facility that Tyson's Farms or Purdue uses. These are small processing facilities. They're USDA inspected, but they're small. I can see everything. I talk to the owner every single time I go. I look at everything. I stick my head in there. I see what's going on with my birds. I follow the process, right? Yeah. On the cattle side, this is even more relevant when you talk about the cattle. The cattle, when we load them up, they are the day before they're going to the processor. We put them in the corral, so they still have access to roam. There's plenty of grass in there for them to eat, but if we need to add hay, we do. And then they're loaded up on the trailer. That's not there's not a lot goes on with loading them on the trailer. They're pretty easy to get on the trailer. We go to Louisiana to do our processing just because we've got a good relationship with that processor. It's convenient for us, and they're USDA inspected also. And when they take them off, they move them down a chute and they put them in what's called a kill box. And literally, as soon as they get in that kill box, they're not confined, but they're where they can't move a lot. And they just hit them with an air gun in the head, and it immediately kills the animal. Okay. And so it's a quick harvest. There's no pain. There's no suffering. And again, I'll go back to a lot of what we see in these documentaries is hyperbolic language, to say the least, right? Yeah. And it's just not the reality of especially what happens in a small individual facility like we use. It may happen still, and I don't even really see it happening in the big facilities, to be honest with you. I think what gets highlighted are more isolated incidents. The truth of the matter is that when you've got multiple USDA inspectors standing over and watching all this, they're not going to let this stuff go on. There's too much liability for them to do that. Yeah.
So then the things we hear about the stress hormones, they get released during this process. Is that something that someone should be concerned about, or is that just more mythology in general?
Well, there is some element to that. I think that also is overblown, but there is some element to that. But that has more to do with, in the bigger facilities, you have many more animals going through at one time, and it's just simply a byproduct of the crowding experience, right? It's not to the same degree, but this plays out to somewhat when you look at the feed yards, in that my animals are never going to a feed yard, right? They're roaming on pasture until the day before we harvest them. Yeah. So when you put them in a feedlot, they're generally in more of a condensed area. I hesitate to use the word confined because most of the time, it's not what we typically think about as an animal is just sitting in a stall, bunched up against itself. That's not really, but they don't have the accessibility to move like these animals should move. Yeah. That carries over when you're loading them on these big trailers and you're trying to push as many in there. Yeah. Also, when you get them into the processing facilities and you're just trying to run as many through, that's where the stress hormones come in. It's not that they're sitting there beating the animals and abusing the animals. It's just not reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. Part of the process. So one of the things I always mention this when I talk about your farm. The first time I went out there, so we're out in the pasture, walking around, and we come up to this little trough. Right, this is the little trough here, and inside that trough you had all these different minerals. You had some, potassium here, calcium there, some magnesium here, And you told us that what will happen is that when the animal innately knows that it's lacking this nutrient, that it'll come up and it will go directly to the magnesium, for instance. If it wants the magnesium, it'll do that. And it is so funny because you think about this, and humans have, other than say conditions like plica, right? We've all heard of plica. So when women are pregnant, they're nutrient deficient in some areas, and so they may go tear off some sheetrock and eat some sheetrock, right? or clay or whatever it is. But we've lost that ability to be that in tune with our body, or maybe we are to a degree, and we just don't recognize it as to why. Right. Yeah. So this is a comment I want to make about that. I thought that was the coolest thing, that those animals know exactly where they're going to go to get that nutrient.
I remember this very vividly after I started using this trough, right? This feeder trough, and it has on each side of it, there's 10 different slots, and we put individual minerals in each one of those slots. And so, as you mentioned, they can self-select. There's potassium in one of these slots. Mm-hmm. There was one particular day in the summer, I had watched this box the whole summer, keeping it filled up with what I needed to replace. They never touched the potassium. I never used any potassium the whole summer. We hit a day in August in one spot in my pasture, and in one day they cleaned out the potassium bin, the whole bin, and they had never touched it up until that point. Wow. And it just clued to me that these animals are so intuitive on what they need, mm-hmm. that they know when the environmental cues, whatever is different in the grass for them, they have the ability to know what they need to make up that difference. Since you've last seen it, we've actually taken another step with this, and we have a sea salt that we keep out there with them. And that's also what we use to fertilize our pastures with. Most people would go, "You're putting salt on your pastures?" Yeah, we do put salt on the pastures. It's diluted down. I use a spreader and we put it out. It's not concentrated like just pouring salt on the ground, but it's rich in minerals. And so it's a way of us continuing to supply minerals to the ground, mm-hmm. and to the microbes and to the plants. And then we also have what many will find interesting. We use baking soda. Mm. And when those cattle reach the point where if there's too much acidity in their rumen, they will go and use that baking soda, that sodium bicarbonate, and they'll balance out the acidity in their rumen to make the rumen more optimal so it can process faster.
Oh, that's the coolest thing.
Yeah.
That is so awesome. I tell you what, so we don't have to really get into the plants in too much detail, because that changes all the time, but yeah, I got that part. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about our own problems we have here in the U.S. with how we grow food. Put it that way, because you mentioned we've heard that the soil is depleted of all these different minerals and all these other things that we need. And what's your opinion about that? Because now that, first off, where we headed in this industry in the U.S., and then secondly, can regen farming, can that actually make up the need for what we may be lacking on that end?
There's a couple of things that come to mind for me really quick on this conversation. One is that it's stated right now that we have about 30 harvest cycles left using, mm-hmm. the conventional model. Mm-hmm. And then we're just going to have depleted soil, and depleted soil is just not going to grow plants at the same capacity.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say 30 harvest cycles, we're talking about just seasons of growing, essentially. So
30
years?
30
okay.
years. 30 years is what we're talking about, okay. there, right? So that's the first thing on that. The second is that when you look at, I'll take a big crop that's produced corn. When you look at the majority of corn is sent to feedlots to feed animals. You scratch your head about that and just ask yourself, well, couldn't we just fence those same areas in and just turn the cows into it and just save a whole lot of, mm-hmm. work associated with that? We wouldn't need to plant, we wouldn't need to harvest, and we could just have grass there that could be routinely harvested, and we'd get the same endpoint without all the economics associated, mm-hmm. with it. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at it from that standpoint and you ask the question, can regenerative agriculture fill in? Can it replace this current model that we have? Absolutely, it can. It absolutely can. And it really comes down to a couple of things. One is that we have to shift what we accept as an optimal food. Corn, wheat, they're not optimal foods for human consumption. Animal products, high density, nutrient dense meats, those are optimal foods for human consumption. And if you also look at where many of these species can flourish at, it's in areas that you're not going to be able to use conventional agriculture. So as the population continues to grow and you need to utilize more land, you can only get so much yield out of land at a certain point. But if I can go into areas that I couldn't do row crop agriculture in, but I can raise livestock in those areas, well, now I just found a way to manage that growing population.
Well, you're pissing a lot of people off.
I would love to tell you I'm sorry, but I'm not.
No, because now we had the climate problem with the methane and the farting eggs.
Well, okay, so you brought that up. So let's not dodge the bullet. Let's just go straight at it, right?
Absolutely.
Because that's a falsehood too. In 7 years of raising cattle, and I'll just be a little blunt about this, have I ever stood in the pasture and as much as I'm around these cows 2 and 3 times a day moving them, have I ever heard these cows pass gas?
Right.
No. So the ideology that we're destroying the planet by increasing methane production that's coming from cows doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Here's the other problem with that argument is that all the CO2, if you look at photosynthesis, which is driving the productivity of these plants, which those animals are foraging off of, the more CO2 that we have in the atmosphere, the more growth we're getting in these plants, the more we're driving.
Yeah,
they need it, right?
Yeah.
It's fertilizer to these plants. So the whole argument doesn't make sense. And even if you start really getting into the nuances of counting carbons and where carbons are going, the argument falls apart.
Yeah. Okay. Well, shit. Here we are now. So let's talk about the messenger RNA that we've heard about in the cattle. Is that true or not true?
It's not true.
It's not true.
It's not true. This is a different conversation based on the species that you're talking about. mRNA vaccines have been in research for cattle, but they are not in use in cattle.
Okay.
Now,
because if you go to Twitter, it's going to be all over Twitter. X. It's going to be all over X.
It's going to be all over X, and beware where you get your information from, right? Yeah. I mean, it is the internet. It's the Wild West. When you look at maybe the bigger question on this is, do we use any vaccines, period? And I don't vaccinate my animals. And some may go, well, especially other cattle producers, like, why are you not vaccinating your animals, right? Yeah. Well, I believe that these animals should have optimal immune systems. They should be able to acquire an optimal immune system from the nutrients that they're consuming and from the forage that's in front of them. Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, I've taken a hit or a time or two. You talked about early on the economics around, what was the learning curve? I've lost animals because they couldn't keep up with the program that we're running. And I don't want to tell you that, and people don't want to hear that, but that's reality. That's if you're going to create and have a herd of animals that meet the quality and the criteria that you're seeking, not everybody makes it all the time.
Well, then genetically over time, I mean, you should have that type of herd that you would want that could withstand those.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. How long are we talking here? This is crazy. Okay. I know we could keep doing this, but I really want to touch on the gut microbiome because we've mentioned when you describe the soil microbiome, it's exactly what we need in terms of our nutrients. And this is a huge topic and something that in Black Bed Health, we discuss this quite often. And in fact, if we had that one test that we could run, that's the one that we start with, right? Yeah. So let's go into that a little bit. And just, if you can explain in real simple terms, what is the gut microbiome? What does it consist of? And then what goes wrong with this whole environment that we have in the gut area?
Ideally, the gut microbiome is a conglomeration of commensal species, and there are going to be some species present pretty much all the time that are what we would consider dysbiotic, opportunistic, maybe even pathogenic. But these make up a low percentage, and the beneficial species keep these guys in check to the point that they're not problematic. The problem, however, becomes when we see the opposite, the dysbiotic, these problematic organisms start to gain more of a foothold, and the percentage of them increases to the point that they begin to suppress the activity of the beneficial commensal species. And so the gut microbiota, when it's optimal, is the combination of beneficial species that you have a commensal relationship with, right? You're giving them a place to live, but in turn, they're giving things back to you. They're communicating constantly to your hormonal system, to your nervous system, to your immune system. They're producing things. They're producing nutrients like B vitamins, vitamin K, conjugated linoleic acid. They're creating neurotransmitters and neurotransmitter precursors. They're really helping to modulate the biochemistry of the body, and they're your workforce that many people don't even realize they have. In fact, many people abuse this workforce when they should be working for them.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. So you mentioned a couple of things there: neurotransmitter development, nutrient absorption in the gut. Give it a few things in detail, not too much in detail, but what could go wrong with the gut microbiome, and say, what do you see commonly in your practice when people come to you? Because there's a whole host of things. There's a reason why I call it the enteric nervous system, its own little ecosystem in that area. What are some of the common things you see with say disruption or imbalances within the gut microbiome?
In the gut locally, and then we'll translate that out to symptoms and clinical presentation.
Okay.
So locally in the gut, you begin to see that the beneficial species, the ones that should predominate, things like lactobacillus and bifido, which many people have heard of. Yeah. Many people have heard about those, but then there's also species that are more directly known as keystone species, things like Faecalibacterium presnitzii or Akkermansia mucinophilia. These also help maintain, in fact, they have a huge presence in maintaining the integrity of the gut environment. Yeah. So when those guys start to decline in numbers, you don't see the integrity of the gut environment maintained. And so the productivity out of the microbiota begins to decline. The natural resistance that comes from having ample quantities of these beneficial species, the resistance to other species, pathogens taking over, to dysbiotic organisms taking over, you lose that resistance and they begin to get more of a foothold. So you start to see the onset and the proliferation of organisms, which people have heard of, like staph and strep, and they may think about those as being more respiratory oriented, but they can overpopulate in the gastrointestinal tract too. And there's a long list of other species here. But this can begin to manifest into symptoms that some would consider to be relatively benign, such things as just a little excess gas after eating, or maybe a little bit of bloating, right? But the truth is that those often manifest into much bigger scenarios. This is where we start to see that they become onsets of unrelenting fatigue. You can start to see the connection into chronic diseases. In fact, there's a very strong connection right now with this dysbiotic state that we're talking about in the small intestine and the stomach, how that translates into the progression of Parkinson's disease. And literally what begins to happen is that these organisms, as these wrong type of organisms, as they begin to proliferate, when you consume a meal, or even we've seen this with medications and supplementation, the resources that you should get from that food, medication, supplementation, you don't get it. Those organisms take that and they use it for themselves at the expense of you. They are literally robbing you to facilitate their own needs. And that whole ideology about commensal goes out the window.
Seems alien-like.
It very much seems alien-like, right?
So, okay. So what about obesity?
So you talked about the enteric nervous system, right? And so I'll just make a quick connection here, which is that of the relationships that we've by far heard the most about, it's the gut-brain axis. As it relates to obesity, there's another axis, and there's numerous of these axes, but there's one known as the gut metabolic axis. And the mechanisms behind which this imbalance in the microbiota drives obesity, weight gain, obesity, is not a single mechanism. It's a multimodal effect. There's multiple mechanisms that are potentiating this. There's inflammatory mechanisms that are behind this. There's changes in macronutrient utilization. There's micronutrient deficiencies that come along with this. There's just the sheer proliferation of certain species that you don't want lingering around in your GI tract. So there's numerous mechanisms that we could say are the problems here, are the culprits.
Yeah. So you mentioned, we know that, serotonin, we mentioned that earlier, right? Neurotransmitter protein, the importance of doing that. But we also know that 90% of our serotonin is made in the gut. And when we go back to obesity, we also know that people that are overweight are 40% more likely to suffer with depression. And so now you talk about this gut-brain axis. How much of that do you think is actually true? Is there truly a relationship to someone that's eating poor nutrient-dense foods, or lack thereof, causing the depression as a result of the microbiome being imbalanced?
The connection is very, very much there. And it goes even to some points that we started talking about early on. When you look at the macronutrient composition, and for example, looking at protein utilization and how that consumption of protein impacts the activity of the microbiota and also the landscape of the microbiota, right? So there's an influence even at that starting point. And then from there, when you look at decreasing the production of serotonin, you're looking at a couple of things here. One is that you're changing the motility in the bowels because the gastrointestinal tract is rich in serotonin receptors. We know that serotonin has, again, multiple mechanisms here by which it acts. It's not just acting on these receptor sites, it's also acting as what we call a mitogen. So in terms of the regeneration of the gastrointestinal environment, I need to point this out, is that the GI tract is only one cell layer thick. So you need to be able to replicate that cell layer pretty quickly to maintain a healthy gastrointestinal environment. Serotonin is part of that replication process. So it facilitates that. Then you start to look at things, you mentioned depression, right? But you also look at satiety and just the not having cravings. Serotonin plays a role for this as well. Yeah. The mechanisms are just on and on where serotonin fits in.
Man, it seems like it's a huge cascade of events. So now I look back at some of the maybe struggling with their weight. They've tried everything in the past. Nothing's working now. A good place to start let's get a microbiome type of a test, right? Now, and later on, I do want to get into some of the testing because, as you know, there's a lot of different tests out there we can use. But what causes all this to begin with? I mean, what is creating this environmental disaster inside the gut for people?
Life. Right? And what we allow ourselves to accept as life right now. And so, for example, when we look at diet, what in general we have been told is food. We used to, we all used to shake our head at processed food, but now we're in a world where ultra processed food is considered acceptable, and it's what a lot of people turn to. We look at just general stress. Just general stress can change the microbial profile. So if you're in a situation, someone goes to work every day and they hate their job and they're already forecasting for themselves how bad of a day it's going to be. All of that stuff is communicating through your nervous system to your microbiome, and your microbiome is going to change as a byproduct of that because you're changing how you use resources, nutrients in your body, and those nutrients again also feed the microbiota. Drug use on this, and I'm not talking about illicit drug use. This is prescriptions, right? So most people are going to be on page with antibiotics, but also when you look at things like PPIs and opioids, these other big categories of meds that are used, and they're used for extensive periods of time, those are changing motility. They're creating a slower gastrointestinal environment. You're not having bowel movements as frequently as you need to. All of that stuff leads to an environment where the gut starts to break down.
Yeah, which opioids, we know the number one symptom is constipation, so that would make total sense. So I've got some strange questions coming up here. Now, we one of the things that we obviously, I say probably the most important test we take is because with Black Belt Health, we're dealing with some pretty high performers. They place a lot of stress on themselves, obviously. So one question is, we have an MMA fighter we're dealing with right now, right? And pretty well-known MMA fighter. But, we run his test, his gut microbiome test, and we noticed that his H. pylori, which you can go into some detail about H. pylori and what that is, and the different types. 50% of the population actually suffers with this. They have no idea, but it's that culprit we think about when we think about ulcers in the stomach. We get his back, and I don't mind sharing my story either. But during COVID, we had probably 60-something employees in the company at the time, and here I'm dealing with COVID issues, not knowing if the company's gonna be around, next week or what was gonna happen with it, right? So all of a sudden, I started having this gastrointestinal pain. So obviously I go do my microbiome test, and my helicobacteria was very high. In fact, it was 4 times what the normal limit should be. So I'm thinking, okay, I got the record now, right. Until we run this test the other day, and literally this guy who's 31 years old is 7 times what the normal limit should be, which your comment to that was, we hardly don't see it over 5.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's just incredible stuff with him. So that's one thing I want to cover on that, because this is, and by the way, in the short amount of time that we've implemented some strategies for him, he's not fatiguing near as much. He's losing weight quicker than he was. He's got a fight coming up, so he's got to make sure his weight's down to a certain level. But another thing that was happening with him too, and you mentioned Staphylococcus aureus, right? Just staph infections in general. And, me being in jiu-jitsu for as long as I was, staph is just something you deal with, right? It's there on the mat, and it's a really interesting little booger because it'll jump from arm to arm and it moves like that, right? So he's dealt with staph infection now quite a bit. I think he's had 3 different staph infections this year. Well, then the physician then wants to put him on some type of medication for the remainder of his MMA career. And we know that any medication like that is going to have impacts. It's going to have side effects no matter what. So he's going to have to deal with the trade-off of no staph infection versus whatever this side effect is going to be. Do you think that because his gut, because these opportunistic bacteria, staph being one of them, was so prevalent, that anytime he got exposed to it on the exterior, do you think that was triggering that reinfection?
Absolutely. One of the primary roles of the gut is to be a viable part of the immune system. Right. Depending on, again, what resources you read, you see numbers anywhere from 60 to 80% of your overall immune function is based in and around your gastrointestinal tract. Yeah. And so when you look at that, you can't help but acknowledge the fact that in a case like this gentleman, where he's putting his body under increased demands of training at a high level, like in the UFC, you're using nutrients at a much faster rate than the average person is out there, and you're not regenerating and rebuilding and recovering. And ultimately that translates into a breakdown in the immune system in the GI tract. Yeah. And it does increase susceptibility. It doesn't just even increase susceptibility in terms of a skin infection. It increases susceptibility across the board. Anything. COVID.
Anything.
Yeah, anything.
Okay. Well, yeah. Yeah. It's really, really interesting stuff. So now what kind of strategies do you think someone could be able to use to make it a healthier gut microbiome? I know there's certain strategies we use that will help them rebalance the gut, but say ongoing strategies in terms of what type of foods should they be eating. I know obviously decreasing stress will be one of those strategies, but what can they do to improve the gut microbiome? Is it probiotics? Prebiotics? What is it?
So at the top of the list, I'll just say no, it is not probiotics on that, and we'll come back and talk about that. Yeah. Make sure I do. Yeah. At the top of the list, and this is the reason that we do this in Black Belt, is that we want a baseline of where that individual's at, right? Mm-hmm. You can have 2 individuals, same symptoms, and what's creating those symptoms in the gut may not be anywhere close to the same thing. So we get a feel for what the profile in their gut looks like, how they're digesting, what the immune system looks like. Is there any inflammation that's occurring locally? And we manage those things. We address it. And in a case like this gentleman, it was a H. pylori that was a starting point, that was a trigger, and that ultimately was decreasing his ability to produce acid in the stomach, which was impairing his micronutrient and macronutrient intake, and really just not allowing him to be anywhere near close to what an optimal recovery looked like for him. But in cases where it's not an H. pylori, and maybe it's a scenario where we need to build up these species, in that case, we're starting to look more along the lines of things like what we call short chain fatty acids. We lean on butyrate, but we lean on fiber in the diet, reasonably consumed, to accomplish that. We'll look at polyphenols, adequate protein consumption. These are all things that optimize the proliferation of these beneficial species. When it comes to lifestyle habits, reduction in stress, but I always, that becomes such a generic conversation that I always like to try to be a bit more specific with that. And the things that really come to the top of the list here: control inflammation. And if you're dealing with inflammation, you got to figure out where it's coming from first. After you figure that piece out, you've got to optimize your sleep patterns. And that's not being 8 hours at specific times, right? You may need more than 8 hours, depending on where you're at in your phase. And then also dealing with blood sugar fluctuations. Those are probably the 3 biggest culprits to causing ongoing stress and changing the microbiota. Yeah.
And back to this guy, he's a very smart individual too, very business savvy too at 31. So he has a lot of going on outside of the fight world too, that it's just keeping him busy.
Yeah.
It's pretty incredible stuff. So, but don't forget about prebiotics and probiotics.
So probiotics, this is a changing landscape at the moment. Most people would say, that mindset has been that I'm going to maintain the health of my GI tract and I should take a maintenance level of a probiotic. I would actually discourage that. And I don't think the evidence is there to support that should be an ongoing strategy. Yep. Where we are evolving to with probiotics right now is more use for an intended application, meaning that specific species to address specific issues. And then once that resolution has occurred, then moving to a pattern where you're doing things like the fiber, the polyphenols, these plant antioxidants, if you will, and the protein. Those are going to be things that are going to universally improve all of the species together. One of the immediate limitations of a probiotic, and again, they have their place, right? But one of the immediate limitations with these is that most of these are going to be based on Bifidobacter and Lactobacillus strains, right? And maybe a little bit of Streptococcus thermophilus. But what about all of the other numerous types of species that are found in the GI tract? You can't touch those.
Even ones that we don't even know of yet.
Even ones we don't even know of. Yeah.
Yeah, so. That's just, so no to probiotic. You know, I heard someone gave an explanation in this is a prominent MD in the microbiome world, and she said, you know, when it's almost like taking a probiotic is almost like emptying your bathtub and then throwing a cup of water back in there expecting to fill back up. You know, so it's really important to have these. You know, you mentioned fermented foods to the nutrients that are there, the fiber that goes in your side of your diet. So it's really, I'm really excited to see where, and there's so many unknown things about this gut microbiome, but I think we're just touching the surface with it, but certainly hopefully the relevance of it, you know, we can get through today. That, you know, it's really important stuff. So I'm gonna ask you a question that was asked to me. So there's a guy, and I don't mind saying his name. His name is Mike Bryan, and Mike Bryan is one of the most winnings doubles team players of tennis of all time, right? Hall of Fame tennis player. But what people don't know about Mike Bryan is that Mike Bryan is a health nut, right? He's not just a health nut, but he's an extremely intelligent health nut. If you have a conversation like this with Mike Bryan, it's almost like you're like, okay, so where did you get your degree? He's that good. So him and I were having a back and forth one time, and he asked me the most geeky question that anybody would ever ask. He goes, so which one's your favorite bacteria? You know, thank God I had an answer for the guy. But so let me ask you the same question. Which one, if you had to pick one out of all these, which one would be your favorite or most interesting bacteria in the gut?
I'm going to say the one I would have to lean on here is Faecalibacterium, just because it is so predominant in the GI tract. Yeah. And it really leads to the optimization of other species. When you don't have good Faecalibacterium levels, you don't have good GI function. Okay. And so that's the one I really would look to. If you're going to pin me down to looking at one, that's going to be the one. Be it, yeah. So mine was Akkermansia. I don't know, because the mucosal lining. That was my second one.
So a geeky answer to a geeky question. I appreciate that. That's awesome. So then last question on the gut microbiome, and we'll end it after that. But testing. Testing is important. You know, what type of test? Because now that it's becoming more popular, we're seeing all types of tests hit the market, right? And everybody's test is going to be the absolute best you can possibly have. So is it blood testing, poop testing? I mean, where's this perfect test that we're looking for?
Well, I'll hesitate to use perfect on this, right? But I think by far the best option we have when it comes to assessing the GI tract in total is a stool test. If you're going to look at the GI environment, you might as well look at what comes out of the GI environment because it's going to give you the most information, right? Within that category, there's multiple stool tests that exist in the marketplace, and you can break these into different categories. You can look at testing that's DNA based and non-DNA based. Many of the non-DNA based tests are what we would consider to be culture and sensitivity. These tests have their limitations. So I'm not an advocate on the culture and sensitivity testing. That leads us back to gene testing, to DNA testing. And within that market space, you have two different types of tests there. You have tests that are really more just acquiring data, meaning that they're just trying to look at what the quantity of these various species are in the gut, but they're not looking at trying to direct a clinical outcome. That takes us to the testing that we use at Black Belt, which is trying to direct a clinical outcome. So we're using DNA-based testing that is allowing us to make a clinical decision that's in turn going to change the presentation for that individual we're working with. And by doing that, we can eliminate these dysbiotic organisms, and we can intervene to a point that it's necessary, but not keep intervening beyond a point where it's not necessary.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. So poop test. got my
Poop
answer.
test. That's it. That's the one.
And yes, you do have. Well, if you have to handle it yourself. It's terrible. It's
Yeah, we're not doing that for you.
It's just terrible. but yeah, it's necessary evil. So you got to do that. So, anyways, I mean, we'll end it here. I mean, we've probably been talking. I don't know how long, maybe an hour and a half or so. But there's so much information I can get out of you, and I've been doing this for 2 decades, as I'd mentioned. So definitely got to have you back. There's so many other topics we can get into in this regard. But anyway, so appreciate you having here, man. Appreciate you all the help that you give us with Black Belt Health as well. So anyway, so that concludes our episode of Black Belt Health. We'll see you next time.